Imagine designing this state-of-the-art rocket. On paper, the physics are completely flawless. The computer simulations show a perfect unbroken trajectory into orbit. But when you finally roll that massive machine out to the launch pad today, Tuesday, July 21, 2026, you suddenly realize you forgot to check if you can actually afford the fuel.
Or if you even have the plumbers to build the coolant systems in the first place.
Or if the crew even wants to get on board. That collision between theoretical perfection and just messy physical reality is exactly what the global economy feels like right now.
We have a massive stack of sources on the table for today's show. We are looking at unreleased corporate earnings reports, shifting trade tariff codes, union labor disputes, and even biometric fitness data.
The overarching theme here is reality testing. We want to unpack the underlying market mechanics driving this collision, translating all that dry analyst jargon into the actual incentives and the weird consumer psychology that is shaping your money and your world right now. And the technology sector is honestly the perfect laboratory to see this maturation process happening in real time, because we have spent the last few years building these massive theoretical blueprints for the future, and now those grand visions are just slamming into physical constraints. Take SpaceX, for example.
They are gearing up to release their first public earnings report after the markets close on August 4th. And leading up to this, short sellers have piled up a massive $25 billion bet against the company. That represents roughly 32% of SpaceX's publicly tradable float.
I want to pause on that financial terminology before we move forward because the scale of that bet is crucial. When we say tradable float, we are talking about the actual number of shares that are available for the public to buy and sell on the open market, so excluding all the locked-up shares held by insiders or executives.
So a 32% short interest means nearly a third of the entire available supply of the company's stock is being borrowed and sold by investors who are actively betting the price will crash.
That is a staggering institutional wager against a company that absolutely dominates the aerospace news cycle. Elon Musk is publicly dismissing those short sellers, stating their survival probability is very low, but the underlying market mechanism here isn't necessarily a bet that the rockets will physically fail to launch.
No. The market is calculating how much hypothetical future growth is already baked into a stock that currently sits around $124 a share, which notably remains below its IPO price of $135.
The short sellers are essentially betting that the valuation hype has severely outpaced the fundamental financial reality of the balance sheet. They're testing the limits of how far investor sentiment can carry a business model that just burns through capital at an astronomical rate.
And this utopian hypergrowth era is essentially being forced into a corporate suit and tie across the entire tech landscape. OpenAI is running a parallel track right now. They are preparing for a potential initial public offering, and to set the stage for Wall Street, they are fundamentally altering their board of directors.
They just brought in David Velez, the CEO of Nubank, and Robin Vince, the CEO of the financial heavyweight BNY. They're completely stripping away that quirky, nonprofit research lab aesthetic they used to have just to look like a conventional, heavily governed financial powerhouse.
That shift toward corporate pragmatism is trickling all the way down to the actual engineering and the underlying hardware of the artificial intelligence boom, too. Google just announced a new trio of specialized Gemini AI models, and the timing of this release reveals a massive shift in how the industry manages its physical infrastructure.
Over the last year, these companies were engaged in a practice called token maxing. A token is the basic unit of data in AI processes, so like a chunk of a word or an image. Companies were throwing massive, incredibly expensive computing power at every single query, regardless of the complexity.
The analogy here is striking. It is like hiring a team of PhD physicists just to calculate the 20% tip on your restaurant bill. You are paying millions of dollars in electrical and compute power for a problem a basic desktop calculator could easily solve.
The bill for that brute force computing power finally arrived, and the sticker shock across the industry was immense. AI requires massive amounts of electricity and highly specialized silicon. Google's new targeted models like Gemini 3.5 Flash Cyber are designed to stop that bleeding.
They are building specific tools for specific jobs to keep their token consumption and their server costs from bankrupting the operation. We are seeing real parallels to the dot-com era here. Back then, capital flowed into anything with a dot-com suffix until the underlying server and customer acquisition economics just broke.
Investors cannot simply over-concentrate a portfolio in the Magnificent Seven tech stocks and assume the AI narrative will protect them from basic profit and loss gravity. Apple is applying this exact same economic pragmatism directly to consumer wallets right now.
They are partnering with the buy now, pay later firm Klarna to launch a leasing program called Apple Upgrade. Because their new AI-capable devices require vastly more expensive memory components, the retail production costs are soaring.
A hardware subscription program completely masks that sticker shock. So instead of asking you to hand over $1,500 up front, they present a highly palatable, lower monthly payment, which simultaneously locks you into their proprietary ecosystem for years.
It is the total financialization of consumer hardware. But I think the most ironic constraint on this entire digital revolution is stunningly physical. BlackRock, Ford, and Google have just launched the Alliance for America's Skilled Trades to fund union apprenticeships.
We are attempting to build the most advanced AI data centers in human history, and the entire project is bottlenecked because the labor market cannot supply enough plumbers, electricians, and HVAC technicians. You literally cannot build a server farm in the cloud.
It requires physical copper wire, heavy-duty cooling pipes, physical human labor. The experienced trades workforce is aging out, and capital allocators are suddenly realizing that a trillion-dollar software industry is entirely dependent on blue-collar vocational skills.
This tension between elite corporate planning and ground-level reality really brings us to how consumer demand actively dictates manufacturing outcomes. General Motors just delivered a massive second quarter earnings beat, and they are raising their full-year adjusted earnings forecast to somewhere between $14 billion and $16 billion.
But they're not printing that money from the electric vehicle revolution. General Motors is actively retreating from its stated goal to make Cadillac an exclusively electric brand by the end of the decade.
Beginning next spring, they are launching a completely new generation of gas-powered Cadillacs. And the financial mechanics behind this reversal are brutal. GM is absorbing a staggering $10.9 billion in EV-related charges just to pivot back to internal combustion engines.
The underlying incentive driving that massive pivot is the transaction price. The average transaction price for a GM vehicle right now remains wildly resilient at $52,000. And that profitability is driven almost entirely by their gas-powered full-size SUVs and pickup trucks.
The grand corporate vision of a fully electric fleet, heavily subsidized by policy incentives, simply did not survive contact with the American consumer, who continues to demand traditional internal combustion engines for their daily lives. But corporations ultimately cannot dictate consumer behavior, especially when pricing hits a psychological breaking point.
Lindt Chocolate recently tested that limit in real time. Extreme weather and climate change have driven global cocoa costs through the roof. So to offset those raw material prices, Lindt implemented an 11.8% group-wide price hike.
The consumer response was immediate. Around the Easter holiday, which is their most iconic and historically reliable sales period, the actual volume of chocolate sold plummeted by 7.5%. Consumers looked at the price tag on the gold foil rabbit and simply left it on the shelf.
That squeeze on the wallet is destroying the supply side of the market just as violently. The United Kingdom's very first sugar processing factory, located in Norfolk and operational since 1912, is now facing total closure by 2027.
British Sugar is proposing the shutdown because they are trapped in an impossible math problem. They are squeezed between low average European sugar commodity prices on the revenue side and punishingly high industrial energy costs on the production side.
A century of local industrial history is being wiped out purely because the input-output spreadsheet no longer balances.
Speaking of consumer wallets and the mechanics of where our money goes, you can find financial candy, brain candy, and classic audiobooks at clarinarcio.com. Now, following that consumer squeeze directly into the foundation of the real estate market, we are watching a massive structural shift unfold due to newly enacted legislation banning institutional investors from purchasing single-family rental homes.
We're talking about Wall Street landlords, firms that own 350 or more properties. Because they are now legally barred from expanding their traditional portfolios of existing homes, thousands of properties are hitting the market.
Right now, there are nearly 9,500 homes listed for sale by these institutions, representing roughly $3.1 billion in real estate inventory. The mechanism of institutional capital is highly adaptable, though. It never just disappears.
Firms like Progress Residential and AMH aren't taking their billions in raised capital and returning it to investors. The legislation left a strategic exception for build-to-rent communities.
Wall Street is abandoning the practice of outbidding individual buyers for an existing suburban house, and instead they are deploying that massive capital pile to act as primary developers. They're buying raw land and building entire sprawling neighborhoods from scratch, designed exclusively from the plumbing to the property management for permanent renters.
While the physical housing stock undergoes this institutional shift, the people actually living in their own homes are staging a massive tax revolt. We are tracking a slate of ballot initiatives across the country in places like Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, aimed at drastically capping or rolling back property taxes.
Florida's proposed Amendment 3 is a perfect example of this. It would increase the homestead tax exemption threshold from $150,000 to $250,000. For the individual homeowner struggling with grocery inflation and insurance premiums, keeping more of their own cash sounds like a desperately needed victory.
But the civic stakes of that victory create a brutal municipal paradox. Property taxes do not disappear into an abstract federal bureaucracy. They fund the immediate physical reality of a town. Economic estimates project that Florida's Amendment 3 would drain a staggering $46 billion from local government coffers by 2032.
The mayor of Jacksonville pointed out the specific operational math here. A revenue hit of that magnitude forces an immediate reduction in essential services. We have to make this visceral to understand the consumer mindset right now, because a $46 billion municipal shortfall means you're waiting 30 minutes for a 911 dispatch instead of 7 minutes.
It means you blow out your tire on a crater-sized pothole outside your driveway because the public works budget for road paving was slashed to zero. Voters are being placed in an impossible position where they must actively choose between their own personal month-to-month liquidity and the basic functional survival of their local city services.
And when individuals feel squeezed by both inflation and civic taxation, they locate incredibly creative and often illegal ways to evade costs entirely. The U.S. Department of Justice, in coordination with international agencies, just seized almost 3,000 websites that were illegally streaming World Cup matches.
This is a direct market reaction to subscription fatigue. The cost of global broadcast rights has fractured professional sports across so many different fragmented paid platforms that millions of fans are simply refusing to participate in the legal market. They have turned football piracy into an industrial-scale operation.
Even when consumers do participate in the legal paid market, the actual product frequently fails to function, which only accelerates that public frustration. Look at the railway network in the United Kingdom. Workers at East Midlands Railway are currently launching strikes over severe safety concerns with the newly rolled out Hitachi Class 810 train fleet.
This is a fascinating example of modern software architecture crippling physical infrastructure. The Union Safety Report details how these new multi-million-dollar trains are operating with deeply embedded software faults.
When the computer system glitches, it requires a 20-minute manual reset by the crew. And the underlying mechanical failure here is that during this 20-minute reboot, critical safety systems are temporarily disabled. The driver actually loses the ability to communicate with the railway signaler.
You have a massive piece of kinetic physical infrastructure carrying hundreds of human beings at high speeds, rendered completely unsafe by a software bug. The crew is forced to strike just to maintain basic operational safety standards.
Governments constantly attempt to force order onto this chaos using macroeconomic levers. But the legal architecture behind those levers is constantly shifting to evade accountability. In the United States, the Supreme Court recently struck down the administration's sweeping reciprocal tariff regime, which relied on Section 122 of the 1974 trade law.
Those tariffs officially expire on Friday. But the administration is not abandoning its protectionist trade policy. They are simply changing the legal mechanism to make the policy bulletproof against future court challenges. They are pivoting their authority to Section 301 of that same Trade Act, launching rapid investigations into 60 global economies based on alleged forced labor concerns.
The legal mechanics of Section 301 are entirely different from Section 122. Section 301 grants the executive branch broad authority to target specific unfair trade practices rather than applying blanket legislative market tariffs. By framing the new import barrier strictly around forced labor, they create a policy that is practically impossible to dismantle politically.
No future administration or judge wants to be on record repealing a tariff designed to punish human rights violations. They are using this specific administrative mechanism to maintain high import barriers, including a new staggering 50% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods, everything from raw cement to hockey sticks, which is set to take effect in 30 days.
The ripple effects of massive government intervention are equally complex in the United Kingdom, where the new chancellor, John Healey, is navigating a highly fragile public finance system. Public sector net debt is sitting at nearly $4 trillion, or roughly £3 trillion, which essentially matches 100% of the UK's entire gross domestic product.
Against that precarious backdrop, consumer electricity prices remain disproportionately high compared to neighboring countries like France. We have to unpack the specific market mechanism that causes those uniquely high power bills in Britain. The UK operates on a pay-as-clear energy market design.
The price of electricity is determined by a bidding process, where the most expensive unit of energy required to meet total grid demand sets the final price for all the energy produced. Because natural gas is expensive, and because it is frequently the final, marginal unit needed to keep the lights on during peak hours, natural gas dictates the wholesale price.
Even if a Scottish wind farm generates power for absolute pennies, the UK consumer pays a premium rate dictated by the cost of burning gas.
I have to challenge the government's solution to this problem because the math feels entirely disconnected from long-term infrastructure. To ease the burden of these high bills, the UK government is cutting the value-added tax on household electricity from 5% down to 0 starting this October.
That saves a typical household about $60 or £45 a year. But to fund this tax cut without adding to the $4 trillion debt pile, they are abruptly scrapping a planned $2.4 billion digital ID program.
Wait, they are trading a massive long-term technological infrastructure upgrade just to hand voters $60 a year. How does that actually solve the underlying energy grid problem? It doesn't build more wind farms or nuclear plants, it just temporarily subsidizes the flawed market mechanism.
It is the ultimate political trade-off between long-term modernization and immediate electoral relief. They are moving capital from a future technological initiative directly into the immediate heating bills of the electorate.
And the bitter irony of government efficiency is that while the chancellor scrambles to save citizens $60 a year on energy, thousands of new parents are entirely missing out on roughly $36 or £27 a week in vital child benefits.
Nearly a third of eligible parents fail to claim the benefit before their baby's first birthday simply because the administrative friction of the paperwork is overwhelming during the fog of new parenthood. The state offers a financial lifeline, but the human exhaustion of filling out multi-page forms with a screaming newborn leaves the money sitting untouched in the treasury.
This intense friction between data, technology, and actual human biology brings us to a fascinating, completely unintended consequence of the wearable tech boom. Devices like the Aura fitness ring are constantly monitoring granular biometric data, specifically heart rate variability and body temperature.
Women are increasingly reporting that these sensitive algorithms are detecting basal temperature spikes and predicting pregnancies, and tragically miscarriages, days before standard chemical medical tests can confirm them.
Instead of feeling empowered by possessing this highly advanced biometric data on their finger, the psychological result is deeply negative. Women are reporting massive debilitating anxiety loops. The underlying mechanism of the technology has outpaced our emotional capacity to process the data.
They are waking up at 4 a.m. obsessively refreshing their smartphone apps to see if their core temperature dropped a fraction of a degree, essentially treating a consumer fitness algorithm as a life-or-death medical diagnosis.
The raw data is delivered instantly, but medical context is completely absent. In many cases, doctors are actively advising patients to take the rings off entirely just to protect their mental health from the algorithm, which gives us a lot to think about regarding how much data we actually want to integrate into our daily lives.
If our wearable devices are starting to measure our biology so closely that it breaks our peace of mind, and our corporate giants are abandoning their grand manufacturing visions purely because our exhausted consumer wallets refuse to play along, the sheer volume of data is colliding with human limits.
We are all on that launch pad right now, waiting to see how the physical world handles these theoretical plans.
The through line connecting all of this is the undeniable gravity of human behavior. Whether you are analyzing the deployment of hyper-efficient AI server farms, the strategic legal maneuvering of global trade tariffs, or the biometric sensors tracking your sleep, raw data always has to survive contact with human psychology.
A flawless corporate spreadsheet simply cannot factor in the sleep-deprived anxiety of a new mother, the exhaustion of a commuter trapped on a digitally crippled train, or the stubborn preference of a driver who refuses to abandon their gas-powered truck. I want to leave you with a thought about where this intersection of data and human behavior goes next, particularly with real estate and taxes.
It is a massive shift.
It is, because if Wall Street is pivoting to build massive proprietary build-to-rent neighborhoods from scratch, completely locking out traditional homeowners, what happens when these institutional algorithms start interacting with local civics? If a corporation owns the entire tax base of a suburban town, does their algorithm eventually start dictating how the town votes on property taxes and public school funding?
Mm.
We might be entering an era where the financial mechanism managing your lease also decides the fate of your local library and your 9/11 response times, entirely removing the human element from civic duty. Something to keep in mind the next time you look at a housing development or check the data on your own wrist.